Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the Spring 2026 George Parker Winship Lecture given by Erin McGuirl and the opening reception for Thanks for Typing, Women's Type Labor in Literature and the Arts. The exhibition has actually been open since January, but I don't know if you've noticed, we've had some precipitation in Boston. So we thought that March 4th would be a safe date. Turns out it was, but by about 24 hours. So thank you all for making it tonight. I'm Christine Jacobson. I'm the Associate Curator of Modern Books and Manuscripts here at Houghton Library and the co-curator of Thanks for Typing, along with Dale Stinchcombe, who has returned and is in town from New York tonight, and will come and introduce Erin in a moment. I just wanted to say a few words about the exhibition and warmly invite you all to stay after the exhibit for the reception, ask Erin questions about her brilliant talk, have a glass of something fizzy, and type on our pink Olympia SM2 typewriter. Also, just a brief logistical note. My colleague Peter and I are going to swiftly move the chairs out of the way so we can mingle more easily. So when the lecture and Q&A period is done, if you could swiftly, repair to the sides of the room, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Oh, that's very kind of you, Peter. Peter and I have got it. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for Typing is a celebration of the women who typed the poems of Emily Dickinson, the novels of Vladimir Nabokov, the plays of Oscar Wilde, and many others. This labor, we argue, has generally been undervalued and misunderstood, with typists seen as mere conduits for the writing that passed through their hands. If you look through the exhibition, you'll meet Mary Weld and Theodora Bosanquet, my favorite, two women who typed from dictation for Henry James, whose style underwent a complete transformation. As a result, some have argued, thanks to his transition to dictation and his capable amanuenses. You'll also meet the women of the Dance Notation Bureau, whose unlikely partnership with IBM in the 1970s resulted in the dance typewriter, an IBM Selectric outfitted with a labanotation ball meant to make quick, efficient work of their choreography notation for the New York City Ballet. And you'll have to read Dale's label to see how that turned out. This exhibition is our way of not only introducing you to these women, but also spotlighting the extraordinary research that has emerged just in the past decade or so, where scholars have carefully surfaced the stories I've just told you and those of so many others. Not everyone, we think, will rush out to read the 2021 essay anthology, Thanks for Typing, or an article published in the Bibliographical Society of America. So this exhibition is our way of bringing broader attention to that work. And in that spirit, I should credit Pamela Thirschwell for bringing us the stories of Henry James's typists and Mara Fraser for her work on the Dance Notation Bureau. But one reason I was so pleased to partner with Dale Stinchcombe is that he has, somehow, in his free time between ascending to Curator of Literary and Historical Manuscripts at Morgan Library, producing the blockbuster exhibition, A Lively Mind, Jane Austen at 250, and attending the New York City Ballet with a frequency even nightly attendee Edward Gorey would have found impressive. Dale has contributed original research to the exhibition on the typists in London and New York who produced scripts for Broadway and the West End, tracing stamps and logos he found on script wrappers on script wrappers across the collections at Houghton and the Morgan, information that is rarely included in the catalog record or finding aid. And you can learn more about that in case 5, called Typing for the Stage. And of course, we are both indebted to original research done by Erin McGuirl, who was a crucial advisor on the exhibit and whose previous research on the work of Hollywood script supervisors is hugely responsible for case 6, Typing for Hollywood. And I don't want to steal Dale's thunder, so I will leave my remarks about Erin there. But I just want to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to you, Erin, not just for your expertise, but for the generosity with which you wield it. And I have to say, the group text thread between the three of us is as joyful as it is scholarly. I just want to plug a few quick things and then I will relinquish the microphone. Dale, Erin, and I have collaborated on a modest, but I hope compelling catalog featuring essays that go into further detail about literary amanuenses, typing for the stage, and Erin's work on the hidden translation of The Second Sex. And those are free for you to take. Here's our Vanna White, Sarah Powell, demonstrating the catalog in the back when you leave this evening. Thank you, Sarah. Secondly, Dale and I will be giving a tour of the exhibition tomorrow together at noon, which you are warmly invited to attend. It's such a treat to have him here, and let's all make sure we really put him to work. And finally, next Friday begins our film series at the Harvard Film Archive called The Lady and the Typewriter, where we will be showing His Girl Friday, Meet John Doe, and The Hudsucker Proxy, with screenings throughout March. Please see the HFA website for tickets and details. There are too many people to thank for the work of making this exhibit and tonight's program possible. Those names are actually printed on our introductory panel, and I encourage you to take a look. Your name is probably there if you had anything to do with this show. But I would be remiss to not sincerely thank my colleagues who make all of the exhibitions and programs at Houghton possible, and they do it with a tremendous amount of care and professionalism. And that's Peter Accardo, Mitch Nekaue, Karen Tran, and Lei Hong Huynh. Thank you. Yeah, that's good. Yes. Without further ado, please welcome Dale Stinchcomb.
Thank you, Christine. I'm thrilled to be here this evening. You'll forgive me if I wax nostalgic for just a moment. Yeah, sorry. You'll forgive me if I wax nostalgic for just a moment. The first time I had a meeting in this room, it was a staff meeting, and I was a student worker, busy spending my summer pasting book plates into John Updike's library, and a sci-fi collection, I think. And I remember attending a staff meeting where a now retired colleague was going on about a conference paper she had given about a 13th century Byzantine prayer book. And I thought to myself, where the hell am I? And how can I work here forever? So I'm especially grateful to Christine for keeping up the illusion that I have worked here longer than I actually did. But those were some of the best years of my life, and I don't think I'll ever tire of digging through Houghton's collections or working with Houghton colleagues. Even before Christine and I knew exactly what was going in the exhibition, we knew who we wanted to invite for this season's Winship Lecture. Erin McGuirl is the curator of the Mortimer Rare Book Collection at Smith College, a role she assumed this past July. Before her appointment, Erin served as executive director of the Bibliographical Society of America from 2018 to 2025, as Special Collections Librarian of the New York Society Library, and as a curatorial assistant to a private collector of screenplays. She has received numerous fellowships, including from the Harry Ransom Center, Rare Book School at the University of Virginia, and the Bibliographical Society of the UK. Her research has appeared in Printing History, Information, a historical companion from Princeton University Press, and her most recent article, which Christine alluded to, Women's Work in Film Production and the Documents of Film History in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, has already helped this curator write the labels for one of these cases. I first encountered Erin's work in an article she wrote about a script copying service in New York run by a woman entrepreneur named Jean Shepard. And Studio Duplication Service printed the lion's share of the city's theater, film, and television scripts, catering to everyone from Tennessee Williams to Spike Lee. And in Erin's words, the story of this shop and the paper it churned out is the secret history of the printed archive of the New York entertainment industry in the second half of the 20th century, which sits squarely at the intersection of the history of drama, printing, and labor. Scripts in studio duplicator wrappers are since I used to work in the Harvard Theater Collection, a dime a dozen there. And somehow it had never occurred to me to ask who produced them or how until I read Erin's work. And it was that work which inspired me to ask the same questions about typewritten theater scripts from the 1880s and the 1890s, which are on display in this show, and which, spoiler alert by the way, were also produced by women. Jean Shepherd's story, Erin reminds us, is the story of countless women, and we just have told a few of those stories in this show. Erin's scholarship continues to examine subjects which the field of modern bibliography has often undervalued by focusing on the labor of the secretaries and typists who produced and edited texts in 20th century American offices. She has succeeded in doing what I believe all gifted curators aspire to, which is to take something familiar, seemingly mundane archival traces, and transform how we see and understand them. And this evening, she will explore a similar question. How did glaring evidence of one woman's work in a well-used archival collection go unnoticed for so long? Please join me in welcoming Erin.
Hi. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here tonight, and I'm just going to jump right in. So, shortly after it was published in France by Gallimard, Blanche and Alfred Knopf hired Smith College zoologist Dr. Howard M. Parsley to translate Simone de Beauvoir's Le Deuxième Sexe. The Knopfs knew Parsley through H.L. Mencken and believed that the man who had recently written an important book about human reproduction would be equipped to deal with Beauvoir. Yes, that is a joke. Good. Okay, it took Parsley 2 years to finish the job, and from its publication in 1953 until 2011, his was the only translation available to English readers. A copy survives in Margaret Sanger's library, now held by Smith College. The anti-feminist Margaret Park Redfield read and reviewed it, not as a translation, but as a text for the American Journal of Sociology. It was Parsley's work that was assigned to readers in nascent women's studies programs across American universities in the late 20th century. And for nearly 60 years, English readers who could neither access the original French or couldn't read it at all were encountering Beauvoir through Parsley. Beginning in the 1980s, feminist critics began to engage in comparative readings of Beauvoir's original and Parsley's translation. They were quick to point out that Parsley's lack of graduate training in French and scant knowledge of European philosophy put him at a significant disadvantage in this dense 2-volume project. Margaret Simon's 1983 article, in particular, initiated a watershed moment for the text that sparked a movement to retranslate Beauvoir. Hers was the first of several in-depth criticisms of the translation, which, at the publisher's insistence, eliminated 10% of Beauvoir's original so that it would fit into a single volume. Simon's criticisms were searing. Compounding the confusion created by the deletions, she wrote, are mistranslations of key philosophical terms. These mistranslations obscure the philosophical context of Beauvoir's work and give the mistaken impression to the English reader that Beauvoir is a sloppy writer and thinker. In 2001, Duke literature professor Toril Moy stated that the translation is even worse than Simon suspected, echoing her critiques of its philosophical renderings. These are just two of several articles and book chapters addressing the issues with the translation, and I direct your attention to them today, not to join the Parsley Blewett chorus, but rather to point out to you that the translation and the archive at Smith has received significant scholarly attention in the past 43 years. When Christine Jacobson and Dale Stinchcomb invited me to contribute an essay to the book accompanying this brilliant show, I wanted to find a new example of significant textual intervention by a secretary. My work has previously focused on Hollywood, as Dale so generously described, and more recently, I've been wondering about secretarial labor in academia in particular. Knowing that the Smith College Archives held Parsley's papers, and after a nudge from my colleague Nancy Young, I thought I would take a look and see if the zoologist worked with a typist or a secretary, and it was not long at all until I found out that he most certainly did. Sabine Jesner Selinger was born into an academic family in Breslau, now Wrocław, Poland, in 1924. Her father, Max Jesner, was a dermatologist teaching at the university there. And although he and his family were Christians, Jesner was of Jewish descent, and as the Third Reich threatened their safety, Max gradually moved his family to his wife's native Switzerland. Before Selinger's 30th birthday, she was living and attending school in Bern with her maternal grandmother. In her earliest childhood and with her father, she spoke German. With her mother, who was Swiss, she spoke Swiss German. And at school in Bern, she spoke, read, and wrote in French. By 1941, it became impossible for the family to remain in Europe, and they emigrated to New York, where Dr. Jesner had secured a position teaching dermatology at Columbia. Selinger's uncle, Dr. Frederick Jesner, became the director of the theater workshop at Wellesley College, and if you Google him, he was like a beloved Cambridge resident, so Cambridge historians definitely read up on him. And soon after arriving in the United States, she enrolled as an undergraduate at Wellesley. After studying French there, Selinger earned a doctorate in French history at Columbia, where she wrote a dissertation on radical French politician and former Prime Minister Edouard Herriot. By 1948, she was living in Northampton, Massachusetts, with her then husband, Robert H. Bass, a fellow refugee and student in the Columbia History program. Both were picking up classes as adjuncts in the history and language departments at Mount Holyoke and Smith College while they finished their dissertations. A note on Selinger's name, briefly. Sabine and Robert H. Bass divorced in 1968. In 1977, she married Peter Selinger, who is still alive and was incredibly helpful and generous to me in writing this and learning about her. And she took his name. So she's known thereafter as Sabine Jesner Selinger, and while partially referred to her as Mrs. Bass, I will refer to her by the name she had when she died. So Selinger met Howard Parsley in 1950. As she put it, in a talk she gave to the Indianapolis Women's Club in 2000, she found out through a friend that Parsley was desperately looking for a typist with knowledge of French because of his sketchy, her word, knowledge, acquired as an undergraduate right here at Harvard. Of course, he's amazing at French. By her own admission, Selinger was not a translator. She was a historian, and she went on to teach French history at Brooklyn College, Kent State, and Indiana University, Indianapolis, where she helped to start the Women's Studies program. In 1950, she was a native French speaker, and she needed the income. Having done secretarial work at Wellesley and City College of New York, she knew how to type. So she was hired, but the exact date isn't really certain. Her handwriting appears on draft materials as early as January 1950, although the annotations themselves are undated. But it is not until October 1950 that Parsley mentions a new typist, unnamed, as the French and German-speaking wife of a young Mount Holyoke history instructor. Selinger's hand appears regularly alongside Parsley's own in his documents from the start of the project in 1950 to post-publication correspondence about the book's reception in 1953. Indeed, the presence of an unnamed collaborator in my early reviews of the papers emerged because I saw two hands and writing preferences at work so consistently. He habitually wrote in pencil, and she wrote in ink to annotate the proofs, make notes. And, sorry, I lost my spot. I saw a friend in the audience, and I was like, oh, yay. And make notes about the transmittal of correspondence or to correct errors. While she seems to have been his primary collaborator, he also hired other typists to help. In a February 17, 1951 letter to Blanche Knopf, Parsley explained that the typists make a lot of minor errors and some major ones, among other things, frequently forgetting matters of consistent form. Thus, I have to scrutinize every word and make the corrections on 3 copies. It is possible that by form, Parsley meant layout, referring to a lack of consistency in typing headings, page numbers, footnotes, or other paratextual elements. In the context of translation, however, matters of consistent form strongly implies that he was correcting grammar. Even if Selinger was directly copying Parsley's manuscript translation, matters of consistent form would have been his responsibility in the original he prepared for her to type. Knowing that Selinger was the more expert French linguist between them, these comments suggest that Selinger made a first pass at the translation, which Parsley then reviewed and refined. Both sides of Parsley's correspondence with both Knopf's and his editor, Howard Strauss, survive in his papers at Smith. They survive alongside annotated proof for the book and a copy of the copy-edited typescript. Sadly, the archive does not hold earlier draft materials. Most evidence of Selinger's interventions have therefore been lost. But some evidence of her work still remains. So here she is editing the index, and this is something that's very frequently described as secretarial, sort of a secretarial task in the handbooks. And for like a little close-up there, you can see she's adding accents to French words. And, you know, by this point in the project, it's not substantive corrections. They've been doing all of this for years, actually, at this point. So it's just all the little things, and it's all really like getting the French right. Here, the copy editor is writing in red. You can sort of see that at the top. This is a black and white image, but the copy editor is suggesting to capitalize Industrial Revolution. She's saying keep it the same. Here's the typescript that preceded that proof for another part of the book, and you can see the copy editor in red. And then there she is in black ink, making sure that name spellings, more accents are correct, sort of all these little things. And then this is something that I haven't spent as much time with, but the Plimpton Press was right nearby in Norwood, Mass. And the Norwood Historical Society holds their papers. And these drafts are also marked up in 2 hands. Oopsies. And I'm wondering, that looks like a lady's handwriting to me at the top. And I have seen photographs of the printing room at Plimpton, and women were setting type in there. So it is also possible that a woman set the type of the second sex. So the letters in particular, though, suggest a collaborative relationship resembling that of modern-day translators of Russian novels, Richard Pevere and Larissa Volonsky. As Joshua Barone summarized their collaborative model for the New York Times, she created a word-for-word, phrase-for-phrase translation into English that Pevere, who doesn't speak fluent Russian, then smoothed over. She took that back to the original text, questioned some of his changes, they discussed the entire manuscript, etc. Parsley and Selinger's collaboration seems to have functioned similarly, if not in exactly the same way. I discovered Selinger's identity by reading her name in the acknowledgments at the end of Parsley's introduction to the translation, where she simply appears as Mrs. Sabine Bass of Mount Holyoke College, but no thanks for typing. So her name has been in the printed edition of the book since it appeared in 1953. And Parsley felt he should explain that inclusion to Blanche Knopf, which he did in a letter accompanying the preface typescript. And you're looking at that letter now. He described Selinger's work as follows. In case you wonder about Mrs. Bass, I should say that she not only did most of the typing, but also kept her eye on the original and had not a few suggestions to offer based on her knowledge of the languages and on her familiarity with the European background. She also located a number of the citations and helped in various other ways. In the talk she gave to the Indianapolis Women's Club, Selinger also described her work in terms that align with and expand upon Parsley's. For a while, I was humiliated by being a mere substitute for a dictionary, but I soon found out that I actually was indispensable to the official translator. I was able to explain literary allusions, historical events, and peculiarities of French culture. Some of my work was tedious indeed. For example, partially correctly decided not to translate back into English quotations in the book that had been taken from English sources and translated into French. And in the correspondence, there's like all this freaking out about how de Beauvoir does not provide proper footnotes, no page references. It's like, I mean, it is bad. It's not helpful. So there's a lot of conversation about this. But in any case, Salinger was a hardworking and skilled collaborator. And perhaps as a woman seeking employment in academia rather than as a typist, she seems to have felt worthy of receiving some credit for her contributions. At the bottom of a letter from Parsley to Blanche Knopf, dated July 27, 1950, she wrote, "Do you think it is about time to let it be known that I'm doing the work?" It would be scandalous for a professor to work in this fashion with an uncredited collaborator today. But at the time, it was normal for Salinger's labor as a translator to be subsumed in her role as a typist. As evidenced by his February 1951 letter, Parsley did not seem to need to hide the role Salinger and her fellow unnamed typist played in drafting the translation. He speaks openly, if somewhat opaquely, about the fact that he was correcting their grammar. Everyone simply accepted the fact that secretarial workers were, if in fact, but not by name, editors, researchers, and writers who shaped the final publication without credit and for low pay. It is impossible to overstate the tragic irony of a woman co-translating a monumental work of feminism in an uncredited collaboration. When she accepted the role, you can only laugh about it. It's not funny, but what else can we do? But when she accepted the role of typist, Salinger took on work for which she was simultaneously over and uniquely qualified. She inhabited the role of typist exactly as designed, compensating for her employer's shortcomings while also saving him from the drudgery of typing work. As I pointed out in the beginning of my talk, feminist historians and translators have attributed many faults to the Parsley-Salinger translation, and these faults reflect the shortcomings of both parties. That said, and in Parsley's own estimation, we have Salinger to thank for whatever historical and philosophical fluency the translation managed to achieve. I think that it is safe to say that the finished work would have been much worse and perhaps non-existent because Parsley was undergoing a series of horrible health crises that left him bedridden throughout the entire project. And without her, I don't think he would have been capable of finishing. So I titled my talk "No Modern Publishing Without Women" to suggest that Salinger's story is not unusual. Indeed, I argue this evening that it is emblematic of women's roles in that industry as it emerged in the 20th century. They were doing the work without getting the credit or the compensation, and their contributions still need to be surfaced. I want to spend the remainder of my time talking about what I see as a lacuna in book historical and bibliographical scholarship that I hope will convince you that there is more work to be done on women's roles in making all kinds of texts in the 20th century. So I think it is fair to say that the field has largely failed to see women as active agents, that is, involved in the making, financing, and distributions of books in book history. Passive, yes. Active, less so. In Carl Kessel and Janice Radway's first chapter of Volume 4 of the magisterial UNC Press series, The History of the Book in America, entitled A Framework for the History of Publishing and Reading in the United States, 1880 to 1840, the authors say they aim to situate the development of a culture of print in a larger narrative about social change in the United States during this period, a period characterized at once by expanding markets, national consolidation, and social upheaval. It is the period that sees the birth of modern corporate publishing. I want to emphasize here that I really mean it when I call the series magisterial, and I'm going to criticize it not because it is bad, but because it is very, very good. I think it succeeded in achieving its goal, representing a range of American perspectives and experiences through an exploration of a growing world of print culture. The essays in the series offer an expansive view of what constitutes the American culture of print, extending beyond the literary canon to encompass diverse social classes and ethnic groups and their interactions with book culture. The producers of print, however, were still largely framed as male. A glance at the index alone indicates that the volume frames women largely in their role as consumers and audience members in the world of print circulation. They don't make it, they receive it. They pass it around. They are affected by it. Women as authors receives a scant 2 pages in this volume, which covers the period during which Willa Cather, Nella Larson, Edith Wharton, Gertrude Stein, Zora Neale Hurston, and Edna St. Vincent Millay were actively publishing, and that's just talking about women writers in the 1920s. Like, there's a lot more in that volume, and they're not in there. And I checked. They don't appear by name either. But by contrast, William Faulkner, Paul Dunbar Lawrence, Henry Mills Alden, Mark Twain, Herbert Crowley, Bennett Cerf, and Marcus Garvey, just to name a few, are all indexed as individuals. Digging a little deeper into the introduction, Kessel and Radway devote significant attention to technological developments, including the telegraph and the telephone, new printing and improved technologies like linotype and chromolithography. They even talk about commercial radio. They also emphasize the evolution of the corporation as a factor in business growth, saying that managing the production, marketing, and distribution of goods in this new national arena required a cadre of administrators and professionals. In creating and training such a cadre, corporate capitalists created a virtually new social class, one that Marx had not anticipated. They were salaried, not owners, capitalists without capital. They were factory managers, sales experts, engineers, architects, lawyers, accountants, advertising executives, and personnel managers, and they scurried to professionalize their training, their work, and their status. Such administrators and facilitators existed not only in the big manufacturing companies, but in supporting firms and institutions. So what's missing? Although not explicit in this passage, the series overlooked machines like the mimeograph and stencil duplicator, and in the white-collar labor bucket, clerical workers like secretaries have been elided. There are, of course, elements of American print culture that just so happen to be gendered feminine. I refer you to Joanne Yates' Control Through Communication for a thorough study of the text technologies that revolutionized American management between 1850 and 1920 for a better sense of their dynamic role in historical change. In terms of white-collar labor, as Yates put it, as early as 1890, 64% of all stenographers and typists were women, and by 1900, the figure stood at 77%. The composition of the office workforce had changed radically. Those new white-collar workers were not the corporate capitalists or salaried workers that Kessel and Radway named. As secretaries and in other clerical roles, women were more than present in corporate offices. They played active roles in managing the production, marketing, and distribution of goods, books included. Kessel and Radway wrote in their preface, Volume 4 covers a period characterized at once by expanding markets, national consolidation, and social upheaval. Women entering the white-collar workforce in such massive numbers, both in the United States and abroad, were actively instigating those changes in all 3 categories. I want to talk now about why that shift in workforce demographics was so remarkable and why its omission from the UNC series is so egregious. I really am trying to argue today that when we talk about the impact of the railroad or the telegraph on printing in the 20th century, that we should be talking about women entering the workforce in exactly the same sort of revolutionary terms. Over 40 years ago, feminist labor historians made tremendous strides in recovery work that clarifies and contextualizes women's entry into the white-collar workforce, particularly in clerical roles like stenography, bookkeeping, and accounting. sadly, and with a few exceptions, making the rule, among which I would include this exhibition on right now, book historians have largely ignored that scholarship. This lecture is not a place for me to give a literature review, so if you're worried that that's coming, you can let that go. But I am going to highlight some key points of relevance to book studies. Elise J. Rotella has shown that the compound growth rate for the clerical sector was 6.71% between 1870 and 1930. During the same period, the compound growth rate for female labor in that sector was 12.28%. In a growing field, women outpaced men by 2-to-1 in filling open positions, and they even replaced men in positions they once held. To quote Marjorie Davies, clerical workers who prior to 1870 had practically been all men were by 1930 predominantly women. This should matter to people in this room because the publishing sector relied on clerical labor just as every other sector did. At the turn of the century, businesses grew because they could rapidly expand their workforce by exploiting an educated labor pool of unmarried women who commanded lower wages than their male counterparts once did. Newspapers, magazines, book publishers, all of them relied on the same feminized labor pool. The white blouse or pink collar revolution was as much a force in the history of the book in America as it was in the history of any other business. Feminist labor historians also contributed to better understandings of secretarial labor. As Davies explained, clerical workers could be divided analytically into two basic groups: low-level employees who executed routine tasks in a manner increasingly controlled and prescribed by employers, and on a level best typified by private secretaries, those responsible for a wide variety of tasks who were encouraged to exercise a relatively greater degree of initiative and independence. Yates and my own work on secretarial manuals show that women created, duplicated, filled out, and filed forms. Women answered the phones. They handled complex business calls and operated switchboards. Women crunched numbers on adding machines. Women typed contracts. Women edited and proofread. Women did research. Women even ghost wrote, just as Dr. Selinger ghost translated. 20th century offices were not single-sex work environments. There was no publishing without the many women who worked in those offices as bookkeepers, accountants, stenographers, typists, and secretaries, and of course, editors like Judith Jones and Toni Morrison, and executives like Blanche Knopf. Women's entries into, oh, I already said that, never mind. The work I have drawn upon has tended to focus on the 60-year span from 1870 to 1930, because scholars were analyzing data compiled in Alba M. Edwards' Comparative Occupation Statistics for the United States, 1870 to 1930, which the Census Bureau published in 1943. More recent scholarship has expanded that date range, and census data is readily available to explore women's roles in the printing, publishing, and illustration industries, both before and after 1930 in the US and also abroad. More recently, the French sociologist Delphine Gardy has published an impressive body of work exploring gender, writing technologies, including shorthand, and mechanization in France and the US, and all the more impressive, she publishes both in French and in English. So, even though it contains relevant data on the number of workers in the paper, printing, and allied industries for periods covered in both Volume 3 and Volume 4 of the UNC series, neither volume cites Edwards' report or any of the secondary scholarship produced using it. With the exception of Ben Kafka's 2012 article, Paperwork, The State of the Discipline in Book History, we seem to have missed it all. Davies and her peers' work has sustained repeated interrogation by scholars of labor, business, and women's history in the intervening 40 years. People are still citing that work. And so given the availability of scholarship at that time, why did the UNC series fail to draw on this eminently relevant work showing women's active engagement in the white and blue-collar labor force? In her essay, Women's History, Joan Wallach Scott identified a challenge in feminist scholarship as rooted in the emergence of the abstract rights-bearing individual as the centerpiece of historical narrative. The whole quote is here, but I'm just going to start with the underlined part. The abstract rights-bearing individual who came into being as the focus of liberal political debate in the 17th and 18th centuries somehow became embodied in male form, and it is his story that historians have largely told. Feminist scholarship has repeatedly come up against the difficulty of including women in this universal representation since, as their work reveals, it is a contrast with feminine particularity that secures the universality of masculine representation. The indexes of the UNC series show that theory at work in book history. Across all 5 volumes, women are always indexed as distinct categorical groups without the same treatment for men. Men and their habits and contributions are synonymous with the history of the book itself. Men's reading habits and activities are indexed under the broad topic of readers and reading, or printers and printing, or booksellers. Kessel and Radway's factory managers, sales experts, engineers, etc., were not named as men, but simultaneously they're not men. And judging by the index and the approach of the book's essays, if they were women, they would have said so. So in my own work, I've been using the term text worker to refer to skilled technicians using specialized tools to complete a job related to textual production for which they were often, but not always, compensated. Text work is labor that makes available text-based products, books, magazines, manuscripts, documents, letters, whatever. I'm using the term to transcend the temporal and technological boundaries that have confined broader book historical and bibliographical scholarship, to place a scribe, copying Chaucer in 14th century England, and a secretary, typing an academic book manuscript in 20th century New York or Northampton, in the same category, and to equitably value their work as relevant to book historical study. More specifically, I seek to position women as active agents in book history. So there, I'm using what feminists have called her story to, as Scott put it, demonstrates women's essential likeness as historical subjects to men, and to refute claims that women had no history, no significant place in the historic business of books. By telling the story of Sabine Yesner-Selinger's essential role as a text worker and co-translator of Le Deuxième Sexe, I am surfacing a woman's history, labeling it as significant in and of itself, and flagging its significance within the world of book history. I also use the term text worker as a play on sex worker to force us to think about gender as a force in textual cultures and in the histories we read and write. The role of the sex worker has been gendered feminine, despite the fact that men and people of all genders have done sex work for just as long as women have. And similarly, women have always been active agents in the history of the book. I'm trying to nudge us toward acknowledging the fact that we have positioned men as doing some jobs, like composing type, and women doing others, like sewing bindings, in the bibliographical imaginary, and then writing histories that reflect that imaginary, but not the actual facts. And in doing so, women's contributions have been largely overlooked. I think it would have been hard to be alive at the turn of the 20th century and not be very much aware of the change in the composition of workplaces from segregated to integrated, at least in terms of gender. Photographs of the Harper offices from the early 1920s, just before their move from Franklin Square to 33rd Street, bear this out. This slide does a lot of heavy lifting for me to show that I'm striving to think about secretarial labor from an intersectional feminist perspective. Wherever we find businesses in 19th and 20th century America, and I think all around the world, we find women filling clerical roles. So, although I'm largely speaking about women, and I acknowledge that we are a heterogeneous group, certainly in terms of race, sexual orientation, immigration status, and class background, I think we can further complicate readings of the book history we've received by thinking of a similarly mixed assembly of text workers rather than historically discrete masculinized actors like typesetters or compositors. So I am now in the final stretch of my talk. You're with me. And that means that it is time to bring Sabine Yesner-Selinger and Simone de Beauvoir back into the conversation. So why am I the first person to dig into the question Dr. Selinger asked more than 70 years ago? Isn't it about time to let it be known who is doing the work? And, you know, I'm speaking about that specific archive because obviously someone is letting us know who is doing the work in this room. And so I'm going to turn now to a previous Winship lecture, that one given by Tom Tansell called A Bibliographer's Creed. And in that lecture, the eminent scholar of the 19th and 20th centuries presented 21 points that, for him, sum up the essential tenets of the field of bibliography, presenting a convenient distillation of bibliographical thinking on the 100th anniversary of the Winship Lecture. And as with Kessel and Radway, I'm analyzing his work not to say that it is bad. I want to say that it is very excellent. It is the best. And it also embodies a patriarchal tendency in the field that I think has made some of our scholarship look like Swiss cheese with holes where women should be. Tansell's influence on this field has been significant enough to merit several collected editions of his many essays, and I think his pedigree as a student of Fred's and Bowers situates him as a kind of living embodiment of the bibliographical scholarly tradition, and so that's another reason why I think it's really important to look at something like A Bibliographer's Creed. My own work has been heavily influenced by his writing, because possibly more than any other scholar in the field, especially when I was really learning bibliography, I encountered a lot of Tansell. And he embraces 20th century books and popular publications in his theorizing. And as someone who was always interested in that, that really made him feel more accessible and relevant to me, and like he was speaking to what I cared about. So in A Bibliographer's Creed, Tansell wrote, "Each one of my 21 points was written to stand alone, but I arranged them in an order in which each follows from the previous one. As if it were a descriptive bibliography, he's numbered his points and arranged them in order. As he said, each point follows the previous one. So his creed is linear. And it is that linearity, that orderliness, that I think bears some scrutiny as a defining feature of bibliographical study in particular. So I want to look at point 5 as an example and move on from there. So after the demonstrations of the new bibliographers who worked with Renaissance literature, it should have become common knowledge that a detailed investigation of the course of action leading to a specific book's emergence from the printing shop in any period is a requirement for the serious study of the work represented by the verbal text in the book. Feminists have argued that the abstract rights-bearing individual was defined as masculine by positioning itself against the disempowered feminine. Tansell suggests a similar definition through differential by positioning successful bibliographical study as serious as opposed to trivial. He's not saying brilliant, useful, he's saying serious. And what is needed for serious study? A detailed, as opposed to generalized, investigation of the course of action leading to a specific book's emergence from the printing shop. Without knowing the sequential linear history, without establishing a sense of order surrounding the artifacts, we really cannot do bibliography. And as it turns out, Simone de Beauvoir has something to say about gender and order. Of course, she says sex, but I agree with Judith Butler that Beauvoir's formulation distinguishes sex from gender and suggests that gender is an aspect of identity gradually acquired. Anyway, woman is the other, Beauvoir wrote. She is passivity confronting activity, diversity that destroys unity, matter as opposed to form, disorder against order. She goes on to quote Pythagoras, There is a good principle which has created order, light, and man, and a bad principle which has created chaos, darkness, and woman. Beauvoir explores these ideas throughout Le Deuxième Sexe, and I could ply you with quotes, but I will simply leave it by saying I think she is right. And within the patriarchal psyche, and I take it as a given that we all agree that such a thing exists and it affects our worldview, women and order don't mix. So reading bibliographical work like Tansell's through the lens of Beauvoir, it seems that many scholars have unconsciously positioned women and bibliography as mutually exclusive spheres of study. It is as if recognizing women in the bibliographical imaginary would usher in chaos and disorder and collapse bibliographical rigor. In light of that, the new bibliography's emphasis on a style of bibliographical analysis and textual study that is, in Tansell's words, systematic, methodical, and scholarly. I think it can be scholarly without the previous two. Was framed by its leading voices in opposition to the new criticism and later critical theory. These movements in literary scholarship specifically produced studies of authorial intention, as well as psychoanalytic and Marxist and feminist readings of texts. Those readings were perceived by bibliographers as unsystematic. In other words, chaotic and disorderly, maybe even feminine. But as I hope I have shown, that approach and the emphasis on order has not produced the desired result. So I'm proposing to you today that bibliography has refused to admit women as agents in history because doing so would be at odds with bibliography's emphasis on order. The long history of the discipline seems to cast a shadow over book history as well. And indeed, I think the UNC series, which firmly positions itself not as a bibliography of the book in America, but as a history of the book there, it shows that the patriarchal bias in bibliographical scholarship has yet to be exercised from the broader field. And the result has been a failure to see women like Dr. Selinger, secretaries, typists, stenographers, bookkeepers at all, let alone as text workers. Historical inaccuracies remain not only in studies of modern books, but also I think in studies of pre-industrial bookmaking when most printing and bookseller operations were family-run. Studies have shown that women were active keepers of household account books, particularly in the 18th century, and I think the assumptions we bring to those records and who was actually doing the writing really matter. I hasten to add that many scholars before me have articulated and pushed back against the patriarchal orientation of the field in different ways. I stand on the shoulders of Leslie Howsam, Margaret Ezel, Lisa Maruca, Kate Osment, Sarah Werner, and the collector Lisa Unger-Baskin. As scholars of the early modern and 18th century periods, however, their work has largely dealt with print and manuscript work before the Industrial Revolution, and I seek to adapt and expand upon their ways of thinking to include gendered 20th century printing technologies and the people who worked with them. With the term text work or text worker, I'm looking to address the breadth of the field as articulated by thinkers like Tansell. Perhaps most importantly, reading book history through Beauvoir and surfacing Selinger nudges us toward more accurate scholarship. As Tansell himself said in his first point, books are physical objects made by human beings, and what bibliographers study is human behavior in the past. If we admit that women, and I think you can fill in women with lots of other identities as well, but my focus today is women, so we'll leave it there. If we admit that women are human beings whose behavior is reflected in physical objects, I think we can also admit that as human beings writing bibliographical scholarship, like our assumptions and the trends of the world and the field are reflected in the scholarship that gets produced. And if we acknowledge that women are present and doing work and active agents of history, will still produce good historical scholarship, and not just good. I think it will be accurate, and I will take that over serious. If the scholars of bibliography and book history aren't seeing the people at work behind the technologies we gender as feminine, how can we expect other fields, like the feminist scholars who studied the partially translation, to do it? It should come as no surprise that profoundly influential feminist thinkers like Toril Moy have not integrated the close looking and material analysis that bibliography demands because those practices have been operationalized in exclusionary ways. How might interviewing Selinger during her lifetime have informed feminist views on the partially translation project? We will just never know. So I hope my work shows that bibliography can surface important information and that about the texts that shape feminist thought. So Thanks for Typing is the first exhibition of its kind to explore the relationship between textual production and the typewriter, a feminized printing technology, nearly 150 years after that technology's invention. It shines a light on how we can learn to look at 20th century materials and see women's labor embedded in them as artifacts. It understands people of all genders as active agents in book historical narratives, and I think it asks book historians, as I do, to evaluate the assumptions with which we approach textual artifacts and to look at other disciplines, if necessary, to test them. It was my bibliographical training that helped me to recognize Dr. Selinger in the Parsley papers. It was simple. I noticed two hands, and I just wondered who those people were. I still have more to do on the second sex. This literally represents what I have done since October. And it has been my great pleasure and truly an honor to share what I have found with you so far this evening. And I just want to wrap it up by thanking Christine Jacobson and Jael Stinchcomb for inviting me to be part of this really monumental show here at the Houghton and for the invitation to speak. And I know it takes a village to put on something like this, so I really do want to thank everybody who has contributed something to make it possible. I really look forward to your questions. Thank you. So Christine and Peter will be walking around with microphones. Please wait until you receive a microphone to ask a question.
Here's your first question.
Thanks. That was super fascinating. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to use the phrase text worker from now on.
Yes.
Yes,
thank you.
Yeah. I just want to throw another give you another tool about Simone de Beauvoir. I don't know if you've read her letters to Nelson Algren. But she was writing, you have, yeah, so you know that she was
I haven't, but I knew she
Oh,
was, yeah.
Yeah, she was writing The Second Sex at the same time that she herself was helping with the translation of Always Come Morning. And that was credited to, the first translator was a guy named René Guyonnet. A poor job, so then Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre stepped in to improve the translation. She did so much work and so much of their correspondence during that period. And she's saying, oh, I'm just finished another draft of, volume 2 of The Second Sex, and I've been working all night on this translation. And of course, not only does her name not appear on the French translation, but also Matin s'est fait attendre. It's called but not only that, but also I've just recently acquired a copy of that translation inscribed by Nelson Algren, where he says, where he's writing to somebody, he says, yeah, the original translator sucked. I got a lot of help from Jean-Paul Sartre, and so totally eclipsing her. Yeah, so I just thought it's fascinating the way that she herself sort of suffered from the same neglect.
Thank you. Yeah, I wouldn't have known that. Thanks a lot.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. I have a comment, and to provoke you to talk about the understanding of order. I was struck by Tenzel, the way you described his 21 steps as linear order. And I don't contrast order to chaos or disorder. I mean, I just don't think humans can think that. They can think. It's not called thinking. So there's different kinds of order. And if you are translating, you're putting a historical recontextualization into somebody else's text, well, that's order, but it's not necessarily linear order. And I wonder whether that's not the better way to think about it rather than
Yeah, I
one
think that's a
gender is
valid
disordered
point.
and the other's ordered. I mean, I know that was a generalization, but
Well,
order.
so Tansel's really talking about specifically analytical bibliography and specifically the kind of book history that we write when we write analytical bibliography. And I think that the place where a sort of rigid order actually really comes into it sort of traces all the way back to sort of studies of classical authors and, how do we determine which, papyrus fragment and which manuscript represents the real text of Virgil. And then, of course, that happens with Shakespeare. And so there's all of this real necessary work. And I'm not saying that that kind of ordering is unnecessary at all. I mean, I'm a librarian. I like order a lot. And I'm really comfortable with order, but I also see that sometimes order can be overemphasized to the detriment of sort of other things coming through. And I think that the emphasis on order and the prioritization of order led to a diminishment of considerations that sort of normally come up in book history, which doesn't emphasize order quite as much. I think like part of the reason I said that we could go over Beauvoir and her arguments about order quite a lot. I just agree with her about it. And right now, today, I reserve the right to change my mind. But today, I agree with her, and I think that there is this sort of undercurrent of emphasis on orderliness that I don't want to put it in really stark terms, and I think that's one of the challenges of these subjects, because Beauvoir would say something like, men have a horror of women and a terror of women's flesh. And like, okay, yeah. But maybe some of that is actually relevant to all of these men who are focusing on all of these other men and really not looking at what women were doing. And I'm trying to understand why. I'm trying to understand why, as a woman in 2026, and to me, this is the first time I've ever landed on anything that resembles an explanation that might make sense to me. So like Tansel, he situates himself really well. He's like, yeah, my creed may not work for everybody. And so my explanation of this that's working for me might not work for everyone. And I don't know how long it will work for me, but that's kind of where I've landed today and why I think the emphasis on order is significant for the field.
Can you pass that behind you? Thank you.
Yeah, I think my question relates to that directly, which is order would be one way to frame it, but maybe another one is somehow it seems to me it's a lot. I'm thinking about the typist versus the translator, right? We've got the typist and the translator. And the translator is a very complex, rich story, right? It's a person who takes this language, this text in one language by one human being, and using another human being's brain, converts it into a different language. And the typist is just this mechanical entity in between, just like the women computers for the for the space program or whatever. Just the word computer suggests this like a very static, mechanistic artifact. And I think that maybe reflects a comfort with storytelling about men and a lack of comfort with storytelling about women.
Yeah.
Like that we, and I'm very biased in the way that I'm coming to this conclusion, because your whole talk, I was thinking about the first printing press in English-speaking North America, which was just down the street, and which is associated historically with Stephen Day, but it was owned by Elizabeth Glover. And why we don't talk about a woman being the first publisher, before that term really existed, but the first publisher in America, and we talk about Stephen Day as the first printer in America, I think comes from a lack of curiosity about how we go about storytelling, about how we recover histories of people who don't leave artifacts behind. Because the women don't leave artifacts behind the way the men do.
Or they don't attach their names to them.
Yeah,
Right.
but I mean, generally, there just aren't as many. They're not saved. They aren't saved by the men who are putting collections together. So I feel like storytelling is another version of the order that you're describing. It's like, just as a bibliographer wants to be able to say, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, resulting in this final object. I think that it is easier to tell a story often about a man than it is about a woman, or that historians are more comfortable telling that kind of story because it has a form already in the form of some kind of documentation.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that relates to the problem that you're describing, which I'm delighted to hear you describe.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, so recently I was just looking at the archives of Alfred A. Knopf at the Ransom Center, which you maybe are familiar with.
Indeed.
Yeah. So what happens when you name a company after yourself? The records of the company are really hard to distinguish between, like, what's Alfred Knopf's records, like man Alfred Knopf, and what's Alfred Knopf's Inc.'s records, right? Because they're all mixed together, there's stuff like account books for the company, which I think Blanche might have been actually keeping and doing the math, that are technically in Alfred Mann's, the human's, papers. And so this is why I'm particularly, I'm not an expert in the early modern period. All I can really say is I just wonder, because accountants don't tend to sign their work, much like scribes, we make assumptions. I was recently in a classroom where everyone is gendering initials like H.D. Simpson, Mr. There's no indication that there's any Mrs. or Mrs. anywhere. We're just using the pronoun he all over the place to talk about people buying and selling cloth. And there's just this instinct to gender masculine, because then the assumption that was made when I brought this up was, well, women weren't accountants. And I was like, oh, really? Like, let me just look that up. I mean, Google, not like research for days. It's Google. Oh, well, there's women accountants listed in the New York city directory from 1796 or 90 or whatever it was. Like, yeah, there were. Maybe it's a storytelling thing. And this is where one of the things I want to emphasize about what I'm saying here is the scholarship we've done is good, and like Swiss cheese is good. Like lots of people, I don't actually really like Swiss cheese, but like lots of people want that on their sandwich and will continue and like should eat it. But there are holes in it, and we want to just acknowledge it and kind of move on. Like, oh yeah, there's a hole there. In Swiss cheese you don't want to fill it. That's the point. But maybe we need to like fix that hole. And so something like, so for me, looking at, I'm not the person who's going to fix that hole for manuscript records. I do want to be a person who's trying to fix that hole for 20th century stuff and say, well, yeah, these are in Alfred's papers, but actually that's Blanche's work. And she didn't sign it, or she didn't whatever, or, oh, actually, what's good about the partially translation is actually this woman, Sabine Yester Selinger, who only people that worked at Indiana know about. And by the way, she was saying this to everybody for years. For years. She was telling people that she did this. And just, it was like, oh yeah, Sabine, she's cool.
I'm going to take the privilege of the last question. It strikes me that in the period you are interested in and talking about, right, especially with regard to type labor, there are two types of really important chaos in play, right? The sort of metaphorical chaos of the feminine, but also of the technology. Like the typewriter and the duplication, the spirit duplicator, all of that, those textual production methods are chaotic, especially for bibliographers. So Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the two of those?
That's so juicy. I haven't thought that much about that. So this is just very much like on the fly. But, I've actually thought a lot about Anne Blair's work and just thinking about like too much to know. Like there's just so much stuff to keep under control. And I think one of the interesting ways to also look at the order-disorder thing is to think about how women were responsible for producing and maintaining all of the files, both. And Beauvoir has some interesting, and I really need to credit my husband for bringing this up to me, being like, what about secretaries? They're associated with order. So if we're associating with them with disorder, like how does that work? Well, the men in charge are sort of like the dads in the household who are out there sort of being out in the world, and they don't have to worry about the maintenance of all of their progeny. And I think because the mother is taking care of that, right? And this is a big chapter in Beauvoir. And so I think that we can think about the chaos of like insane amounts of textual production in that period in light of that. Like your boss says, run off 100 copies of that. And then you have to deal with it, right? Like maybe he doesn't need it, or maybe he has a correction to make, sounds like 18th century writers, at the last minute, and you've already typed that stencil and blah, 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 blah. Like, secretaries are sort of secretaries are really stewards of the texts they create. And I think that one of the things that I've been struck by over and over again when I read about like interviews with women who were working in Hollywood, particularly during this period, but I also think, when you read the whole talk, which is part of the archive of the Indianapolis Women's Club, when you read the whole talk, you really get the sense that she was super proud of the work she was doing, and I think that role that they, sort of as we were talking about before, it's like women weren't able to ascend. That glass ceiling is really there. And so when they're running up against it, they are really digging into what they can actually do, which often is extremely intellectually stimulating because, one of the things that I discuss in my essay in the catalog is just how much writing women were expected to do in office spaces. And like white papers, like business white papers that get circulated to, not just in publishing, in like finance and legal offices, and I don't know about the commercial world, so I shouldn't speak about it. But they're really producing all that stuff, and I think they found it to be rewarding and challenging work. Not all of them, but I think some of them certainly dug into that. So there's this like way that through this role of being maintainers of order, they actually can transcend it a little bit. But the technological piece is essential. I think without the technological piece, you don't have this opportunity to enter offices in the way that women did.
Over food and drink, and join me in thanking Erin for her talk.